Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 3 of week 8, and the Republican notion of freedom is the topic of today's lecture. It is in continuation of lecture 2. So in this lecture we will study what is freedom as non-domination. We have already studied something about this concept and we will study more about it. Then second, important elements of freedom as non-domination. Then what are the benefits of freedom as non-domination? Then freedom as an egalitarian and also a communitarian good. So we will understand that how freedom as non-domination is both an egalitarian good as well as a type of communitarian good by giving certain examples. Now according to Philip Pettit, there are two grounds for considering liberty as non-domination to be the Republican conception of liberty. He has given two grounds. The first is, in contrast with the modern tradition, the Republicans see liberty in terms of opposition between labor and servers, meaning the citizen and slave. The individual is not dominated by others as it is found in the case of slave. So, we have already seen the difference between the negative liberty and liberty as non-dominance. And here it is again explained that in contrast to the modern tradition, we find that in the Republican tradition, we understand the relation in terms of the relationship between master and slave. And the objective is to ensure that individual is not dominated as we find in the case of master and slave. Second, even if interference occurs under the scenario of non-mastering interferer, it will not make people unfree. So, we have also, with the help of the example of master and slave and also with the help of another example in our earlier lecture, I have explained that how there can be interference without domination and it may not be harmful for the well-being of the individual. So, therefore, by contrasting liberty with slavery, liberty has been identified with non-domination rather than non-interference. So, we can say that based on the arguments which have been given by Philip Pettit, it can be summarized that the liberty which is identified with non-domination is much more better in comparison with the liberty of non-interference, and this has been arrived by contrasting liberty with slavery. Now, we have another scholar, Harrington, who equates non-freedom with slavery, where the individual has to live at the arbitrary will of another. Freedom is removal of dependence and vulnerability. So, Harrington also argues, because he also belongs to the Republican tradition, he argues that non-freedom or absence of freedom is equivalent to slavery. And in the case of slavery, we know that individual has to live at the arbitrary will of another person or the master. And if we want to understand the true meaning of freedom, freedom means absence of dependence. If we are dependent on some person, then it is not freedom. If we are vulnerable to be attacked or to be exploited, then also there is no freedom. Non-domination means to create conditions where people may not be able to dominate over others. It is blocking the capacities of others to interfere in our lives, which is not possible in the case of non-interference, because non-interference is very specific when it is saying that nobody will interfere in the activities or in the exercise of choices by others. So, here the right is limited to only one particular segment of human endeavor, which is non-interference. But we know that there are various conditions or contingencies in the society where we find that there are chances that some people may dominate over others. And we find that in the society there are circumstances, there are places where people have the capacity to dominate over us. It is another thing that they are not dominating because they may not be having that intention, or they may be good by nature. The potentiality or the capacity or the probability to interfere, to dominate, if it is there, then it is not freedom. So, therefore, non-domination is very particular about creating conditions where some people cannot get the opportunity to dominate over others. There is no probability to dominate. It also means blocking the capacity of others to interfere in our lives. So, therefore, non-domination is a much more wider, much more elaborate concept. Non-domination can be achieved in a society where either people are given equal powers or there are legal measures to check people dominating others. So, how to ensure that we are able to enjoy freedom of non-domination? So, there are basically two conditions. The first is that either you make everybody equal, all the individuals should have the equal powers, so that in terms of power relation anybody cannot exercise the dominance of power or exercise of power over the subordinate. And the second method is that the state develops certain legal measures, certain institutional measures and practices which can check people from dominating others. So, these are the two methods. Now, again explaining the nature of non-domination, Phillips Pettit argues that non-domination has a subjective and intersubjective aspects. What we mean by having a type of subjective aspect and an intersubjective aspect? Because non-domination is related to the individual, or the freedom of non-domination is related to the individual, and it is to be exercised in relation to other individuals, because I may be dominated by some person or by certain circumstances. So, it is very much contingent or dependent on the type of person with whom I am coming in contact, or anybody is coming in contact. So, there is an element of subjectivity in that, and since we need one or two people or two conditions where a type of domination can be exercised, so it is intersubjective in nature. So, I cannot be dominated by a person who is not in existence. So, we need an intersubjective understanding of non-domination or even domination. Non-domination increases as the conditions that make people unfree are reduced. Non-domination increases as the condition which makes people unfree are reduced, because the more there are such conditions and the potentialities of domination or those conditions which makes individual unfree, there are chances of more domination. And where the conditions which makes people unfree are reduced, there are chances that the domination will also reduce, or the non-domination will increase. Now, there are certain benefits which are associated with freedom as non-domination. What are those benefits? The first important benefit is absence of uncertainty. Why there is absence of uncertainty? Because if suppose, for example, we imagine that there is a condition or there is a situation where there is no such right or no such freedom of non-domination, then in such a society or condition, we are not sure that whether there are certain exploitative structure or practices or some powerful people who may try to exploit us, who may try to dominate over us. And since we do not know how to counter it, since we do not know that when such situation can arise, therefore, it leads to a stage of uncertainty or a period of uncertainty. Second is absence of a need to differ strategically to the powerful and the absence of social subordination to others. Now, we know that it is not simply sometimes because of fear or only because of fear that one becomes subdued or one becomes subjugated to others. It is not always the sense of fear or by the means of coercion that one becomes subservient to others. Sometimes it is also because of need that we take the help of the mighty and the powerful and to rescue us from our crisis. So, that also is a type of dependency that also shows the vulnerability which makes the people dependent and in a continuous relation of dependence on the rich and the powerful. So, therefore, absence of a need to differ strategically to the powerful. So, if you are equal and there is no conditions and possibilities of exploitation, then obviously there will be no need to go to them. You will be yourself powerful and empowered to deal with the situation. And the second is that absence of social subordination to others. There is no need of social subordination, because all those conditions and situations or practices which promote such domination is removed. So, therefore, these are the two important benefits of freedom as non-domination. Now, another important point with respect to this freedom is that this freedom cannot be left at the hands of the people so that they can pursue it in their own way, or it cannot be a type of decentralized process. It has to be pursued via the state. Very, very important. If we leave it in the hands of the individual, then there are chances that these rights may not be properly followed. These rights may not be properly exercised. And one of the reason is that the conditions or the situation which are responsible for creation of dominance, they may not be possible for an individual to remove on its own. The state has all the machinery and all the measures at its disposal to remove and prevent all those conditions which can create a relationship of domination of any kind. So, therefore, they have argued that it has to be pursued via the state. State should promote freedom as non-domination as a value. So, it is not simply that because of some contract or because of some a contingent reason or because of some other political reason, the state should pursue freedom as non-domination. State should consider it as the basic value or principles which should form its everyday practice or which should form the basis of its constitution, that its aim is to promote freedom as non-domination. Now, two dimensions have to be taken into consideration when promoting freedom as non-domination. The first is intensity of non-domination and the second extent of the undominated choice. The intensity of non-domination means to what extent, what is the level, what is the depth, what is the extent non-domination, what is the intensity, and the second is extent of undominated choice. What can be the limit of undominated choice? Can it be unlimited or can it be there can be some limit on the exercise of choice in certain circumstances? These are some of the things which have to be taken into consideration. Then very important aspect of freedom as non-domination is that there is need for institutional arrangements to protect these rights, because without the institutional arrangements you cannot ensure that freedom of non-domination is actually exercised, it is also protected and upheld by the people. Some of the important qualities, some of the important aspects of freedom as non-domination. And the first is freedom as non-domination is an egalitarian good. What we mean by egalitarian good? Egalitarian good means thinking about the well-being of all. Maximizing non-dominance means that people are able to enjoy it under all types of circumstances. So, egalitarian is manifest, or it is manifested in the sense that people are able to enjoy the maximum freedom of non-dominance under all circumstances. It is also related to structural equality, because these are the fundamental reasons. Sometimes the structures are responsible for the root causes behind the practices of injustices and exploitation. So, if we are talking about freedom as non-domination, we have to talk about change in the structures. And when we are talking about making changes in the structure, we have to talk about the need for structural equality, where people are protected against all types of domination. So, we have to change the structures, we have to change the institutions, we have to change the practices which are responsible for the perpetuation of domination and exploitation in the society. Now, a very fundamental question arises that if we talk about non-domination of choices, then what about the children who are so young in terms of age, and also they cannot be compared with the adults on the same plane. Children, they are of a very vulnerable age, and at the same time they need to be disciplined because they are pursuing the path of education. So, how they will be treated under the regime of freedom as non-domination? Should they be left under the mercy of the guardians and their teachers? Now, this is another very pertinent point or question which has been raised regards the freedom as non-domination. Obviously, the answer is no, because when we are talking about freedom in terms of absence of arbitrary exercise of will over another person, then we cannot leave the children at the mercy of teachers and the guardians, because the children enjoy the same intensity of non-domination in the sense of being protected against arbitrary power. Perhaps they need it more, because they are young and they are vulnerable, they are innocent. So, they are more prone to exploitation, and therefore, they need more protection, and the intensity of freedom as non-domination is much more applicable to them as for any other people in the society. But of course, there is a certain restriction. The need of education and discipline will lead to the reduction in the range of choices that are available to the children, because if we give all the range of choices to the children, then it may be harmful for their growth and development. So, naturally, in terms of range of choices, there has to be some restriction so that they can lead a disciplined life and use the opportunities which are there before them for their development. Now, parents will be having the power to discipline the child, but will be subjected to various restrictions. So, freedom as non-domination does not mean that parents cannot discipline their children, because that is absolutely necessary, otherwise it will not be for the benefit of the children. They are to be disciplined, but there are certain restrictions. First of all, they will apply restriction only to the extent which will seek to advance the interest of their children. So, it will not be arbitrary. The exercise of power by the parents over the children will not be arbitrary, but it will be in a very rational manner, only to the extent that it promotes the interest of the children. Second important thing is that they will seek to advance the interest of the children in the standard manner, or the standard practices, or the standard values. They will not do anything which is beyond normal, or which is not an accepted procedure or path. So, therefore, these are the two conditions which has been imposed or which has been put to restrict the parents to use their power over the children in an arbitrary manner. Now, the next important aspect of freedom as non-domination is that it is also a communitarian good. And what is the meaning of communitarian? Communitarian means when we are talking in terms of the community, with the goals and objectives and interest of the community in mind, then we say that we are adopting a communitarian approach. Now, freedom as non-domination is also a communitarian good. It can be realized only under an arrangement involving people in communal interaction. So, we are talking about not individualistic rights, which is associated with the liberal notion of rights, which is talking of rights in terms of individual or individualistic exercise of rights. Here we are talking about individual as well as an individual being a part of the community. So, we are talking about the community also, or the Republicans are talking about the community also, because they consider that individual exercise their rights by being integral part of the community. So, by involving people in a communal interaction, freedom as non-domination can be better realized rather than individual seeking it on his or her own self. We will illustrate this with the help of an example after some time. Being communitarian also has another meaning. It means that the freedom of community is equally important as the individual. So, it is not simply we are talking about individuals, but we are also giving importance to community, the rights of the community or the freedom of the community, because an individual can enjoy or realize his rights and freedom only being a part of the community. Because we know that most of the time various types of practices, behavioral problems are found at the community level. So, therefore, we cannot leave behind the community when we are talking about the freedom of the individual. The communitarian ideal is important because there are rights which an individual can enjoy only when all the members of his community are also enjoying equal rights. Now, this can be seen especially with respect to the community which are identified on the basis of gender, caste, sexuality, race, ethnicity, etc. So, we all are at different levels members of various groups, or individuals are members of various groups because of their multiple identities, and being a member of a particular group having a certain identity brings with it certain set of acceptance, and it also brings certain set of a type of prejudices and a status in the society. And therefore, when we are talking about rights, then we must remember that an individual can enjoy rights only when all the members of his community are also enjoying equal rights. So, it is not simply an individualistic understanding, but an understanding at the community level. Most of the time, we as part of a community suffer lots of discrimination and injustices. For example, a person belonging to a particular caste faces victimization because of his belonging to a particular group having a certain identity. A woman is not an individual when she is victimized. She is victimized because of her identity as belonging to a particular group. So, therefore, we can find that every individual, they may be facing various types of prejudices and injustices at the individual level, but that connection is there at the community level also. Being part of a community increases the vulnerability of an individual to a large extent. For example, a woman who belongs to a Dalit community faces more vulnerability in comparison to another woman who may belong to some other community. So, therefore, we have to take into consideration the membership of community when we are talking about rights. So, in this respect also, it is a communitarian ideal, because freedom as non-domination addresses the problem at the community level also. Now, we are going to illustrate this with the help of an example. Suppose we take a society and we are taking the instance of a woman who is not tortured or who is not being physically abused by her husband, maybe because of various reasons. She may be very much loved by her husband, or there may be some other reason why the husband is not indulging in any physical abuse. But we must also remember that we are talking of such a woman in a society where there is no law or legal measures to protect women against physical abuse, nor the culture is such that which prevents women from being physically abused by her husband. Suppose we do not have either of these two, and still we find that a woman is not being physically abused by her husband because of the reasons which I have mentioned. So, a particular woman can be fortunate if she is not being abused by her husband, but it does not mean that other women are also in similar situation. There may be some other family where a woman may be physically abused or victimized by her husband. Now, the difference in the two situations does not make the two women's stake in any way different with regards to non-domination. Stake of both the women are same. At the individual level, we may see that one is facing victimization and other is facing no victimization. So, the woman who is not facing any victimization may feel that I have no stake in that. No, it is wrong. They both are having equal stake in the freedom as non-domination. And the first reason is that the fate of the women are interconnected with each other, because the women, they belong to a particular community which is having a distinctive identity, and the possibility of arbitrary interference itself creates a situation of women being vulnerable. So, we see that in the case of the second woman where she is getting victimized, and in the case of first woman where she is not victimized, she is not physically abused, we know that in the first case there is the possibility of arbitrary interference. Because when we are talking about women as a community, then we know that there are certain social conditions and the type of relation between a man and a woman and the cultural practices, they provide such fertile conditions for the physical abuse to take place, and if it is not taking place, then it is there can be various reasons behind that, but the possibilities for the eruption of such type of violence are very much there in such societies. So, therefore, woman who is having a loving husband is still subjected to possibility of domination by her husband. Hence, there is need to create conditions and institutional measures so that there is no possibility of arbitrary interference. So, with that I come to the end of this lecture, followed by two questions, which is why freedom as non-domination is better than other types of freedom, and try to answer this question with the help of some examples. How freedom as non-domination is an egalitarian and also a communitarian goods. So, with this I come to the end of this lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.